Most of the time we talk about how to do something. Today we're going to be talking about when you should be doing it. That's coming up. Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Reeks. This is Weaver Leather Supply. Today we're going to be talking about the order of operations when it comes to tooling. And really we're going to be using floral tooling as our example. But we've gotten a lot of questions in the comments about when should I do the individual steps, and that's what we're going to talk about today. First thing that we need to say and kind of get out of the way is that this is just a general guideline. If you're a beginner looking for a rough idea of when to do what, this is going to work really well for you. If you're more experienced, then you're going to know that this order of operations that I'm going to give you is pretty flexible, and there's a couple of them that you can switch around. But if you're looking just for a nice general rule of thumb, this is going to work really well for you. In one of our last videos, we tooled this floral pattern. And if you'd like to see how we tooled it, we'll put a link in the description. But we're going to be using this as our example piece today on when to do the individual steps. Anytime we're starting a project, the order of operations always starts with the prep steps. We're going to case the leather, then we're going to trace the pattern onto the film, then we're going to transfer it to the leather, tape the back, and then if we're going to use one, we can use our wing dividers to put the tooling window in. So we're going to be going through quite a few steps here pretty quickly, and I know you're going to have questions about the individual steps. Most of them we've already done videos on. So if that's the case with individual steps, I'm going to put a graphic right down over here, and that'll just say link in the description, and that'll be your cue to know that, hey, if I want more information on this, I can just go to the video description and there's a link to that individual video. That way I don't have to stop and say, hey, we did a video on it every single time. So after we've done the prep steps, we're going to need to set our leather aside and let it rest. And what I mean by rest is we want that moisture content to permeate through the fibers of the leather, and we want the leather to come back to a point where we can tool it. We don't want it too dry, we don't want it too wet. Now that we've got that done, we can actually start the tooling process. And most of the time, that's going to start with cutting it in with a swivel knife. And the only thing I'd say here is just make sure you strop your blade really good before you start cutting it in. Once we've got it cut in, we can go ahead and bevel the design. Now at this point, we've got a few different options, a few different forks in the roads that we could take. We could put our background in. We could start working on the shading. We could use our pedal lift. There's a bunch of different options here. But really, the one that makes the most sense to me is our pedal lifters. And the reason I say do that next is as we're using those pedal lifters, they can leave a heel mark. And if you've already done your background, well, that's going to mess up the texture of your background. You're just going to have to go back and do it again. So if we go ahead and use our pedal lifters now, we can avoid having to repeat work that we've already done. So let's recap. What have we done so far? We've done our prep steps. We've used our swivel knife to cut in the design. We've beveled the project, and we've used our pedal lifters. What's next? Well, what I'm going to encourage you to do next is going to be to do the background. And the reason for that is it really helps define the project and really is going to make the shading process a lot easier. Then we come to shading, and shading encompasses a lot of different things. This could be your pear shader, it could be a thumbprint, it could be a mule's foot, the flower center, the center shading. There's all kinds of things that fall into the shading category, the shading step. But that's where I'm going to suggest that you start next. Obviously, there's so many different options here that we could go through. It would take an hour to cover them all. So I'm just going to lump them all into the shading category, the shading step. And really the main things here that I'm talking about are going to be your pear shader, your thumbprint, and your center shader. Once we're happy with our shading, we can work on our decorative cuts. At this point, I'm going to assume the tooling portion of the project is done. I know there's a lot more that we could do with it, but we're working on general order of operations. So at this point, I'm going to assume the tooling portion is done, and we're ready to move on to the finishing stage. Now, I'm going to assume that we're working with antique and not paint, because that's more common. So the question we got to ask ourselves is, with the antique, do I want it to stain and color the leather, or do I simply want it to settle into the low spots and the design that I've carved into the leather and accentuate the tooling? And more often than not, what I find is people are wanting that second option. They really don't want the antique to stain the leather. They simply want to accentuate the tooling and the work that they've done. Assuming that's the look that you're going for, the next step is simply going to be to seal the project. That's going to protect the leather while letting that antique settle down into the low spots. My go-to for this is going to be tan coat. You can use whatever liquid sealer you want. The aerosols don't work as well for this particular application. Once we've given the sealer time to dry and it's not tacky anymore, that's very important. Once it's dry and it's not tacky anymore, now we can add our antique. My favorite is going to be Fiebing's Antique Finish. Now there's gels and all kinds of other stuff out there. You can use whatever works best for you. My go-to is going to be the Antique Finish from Fiebing's. And this is just a matter of smearing it on the project and letting it sit anywhere between a minute and an hour. Something like that. The most common is about 15 minutes. A little side note, if you do want the antique to color the leather, then just don't seal it. Just put your antique directly on there and you're good to go. So let's recap where we're at. We did the prep steps, we cut it in with a swivel knife, we did our beveling, pedal lifters, backgrounding, shading, decorative cuts, sealer, and then we antiqued it. And at this point, you may be noticing that the project looks a little muted or muddy. Well, that's because there's a residue of antique still sitting on our project. And an easy way to brighten it up and get rid of that residue is just to go back over the project with another light coat of whatever sealer we used to seal the project with. So I can hear some of you out there asking, well, what about neat's foot oil and adding oil to your project? Well, that's a little bit of a wild card. And really, it's going to depend on what sealer you're using. If you're using a sealer like a lacquer or something that doesn't allow the oil to penetrate, well, you're going to need to use the oil before you seal it. If you're using something like tan coat that's really good about allowing that oil to permeate and penetrate that seal, then you can do it pretty much at the end of the project, which is what I typically do if I'm going to put oil on the project. Well, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you found it helpful. I will see you in the next one. In the meantime, go make something amazing.